2021 event, Childcare at the Crossroads again. Thanks to our very able simultaneous interpreters, you can follow this event in English or in French. To follow in French, click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your window and then select French. You will immediately hear the interpretation in real time. You can completely turn off the background audio by clicking the interpretation icon again and select mute background audio. There is no need to change any of the settings to follow along in English, and we'll be putting these instructions in the chat box for your reference. I'm Layla Sarangi. I have the honor of serving as the National Director for Campaign 2000, Canada's national coalition to end child and family poverty. And I am also very proud to serve on the board of directors of Childcare Now, Canada's National Childcare Advocacy Association and host of today's event. I would like to begin by acknowledging that this event is taking place on the lands that have been inhabited by Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. I am a settler on this land, the daughter of immigrants and refugees. On behalf of myself and my colleagues, I thank the generation of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land and express gratitude for the opportunity to be here. I am also mindful of broken covenants. We know that our acknowledgement is meaningless until we understand that we are all treaty people and act on our collective commitment to ensure that truth and reconciliation becomes a reality. We draw particular attention to the calls to action, especially the call to fully implement Jordan's principle and the call to develop culturally appropriate childhood education programs for Indigenous children, families, and their communities. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Silvana, National Director of Public Policy and Strategic Communications for Ywca Canada, Canada's oldest gender equality organization and one of the largest providers of not-for-profit early learning and childcare programs across the country. Over to you, Anjem.
Thank you, Layla, and I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to be here and to moderate this very important question during election season. And I appreciated the land acknowledgement just now, and I've learned from many about the importance of being authentic and sharing your personal perspective when it comes to land acknowledgement. So I'll just quickly share my own story. I'm an Indian Canadian. I was born in India, came to Yemen and Saudi Arabia, and then came to Canada. And so that's my own journey to this land. And I firmly believe in the importance of, as a settler, my obligations as a treaty person. So I did want to share that from the beginning. And before we begin this very important discussion, I wanted to share that there is an opportunity for you to share online the insights and findings from this conversation. If you're like me, you may be active on social media. So we did want to encourage you to please amplify the things you share, things you hear during the session through tweets and other postings. We encourage you to tag @child_care_now and use any of your favorite appropriate hashtags such as Canadian Childcare, Canadian Poly, Election 44. And you can check out the chat box for suggestions throughout the conversation. Now let's start by setting some political context for the discussion. Although many of us wish the political parties and candidates in this election would give more attention to childcare, the fact is that the issue has been talked about more than in any other previous election, and this is a good thing. The Liberals are running on their budget 2021 commitment to spend $34 billion over the next 5 years to fund the start of a Canada-wide system of primarily not-for-profit and public early learning and childcare. Prior to the election call, the Liberal government had secured funding agreements with 7 provinces and Yukon Territory, which tied federal funding to major reforms, including $10 a day childcare by 2025-2026, a major expansion of regulated childcare in not-for-profit and public sectors, as well as a raise for early childhood educators who are providing that essential labor that keeps our entire economy going. The NDP has also pledged $10 a day childcare, and the Greens have said they too would build a system of universal childcare. The Conservative Party of Canada, on the other hand, proposes to cancel almost all the budgeted federal funding for early learning and childcare, terminate the negotiated agreements, and instead fund a refundable childcare tax credit. Our four expert panelists are going to help us sort through all of this childcare policy and what this means for the future of childcare in this country, because we are indeed at a crossroads. With us today, we have Chantal Krish, mother of two, a BC childcare advocate and advocate for equity and inclusion. And I should say also previously with a YWCA Metro Vancouver, so definitely got to give that YWCA a shout out. Margot Greenwood, a professor at the University of Northern British Columbia and a longtime childcare advocate for Indigenous early learning and childcare, and who I always learn immensely from anytime I hear her speak. David McDonald, father of young twins and economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, who has carried out some of the best research on childcare affordability and availability in Canada. And Sophie Mathieu, a doctor of philosophy and sociology and postdoctoral researcher at the Université Telcook and expert on Quebec's system of early learning and childcare, which we often look to learn from in the childcare world. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us and taking part in this discussion. Before we begin, I should explain some housekeeping briefly. We do have a large number of people present and in this online session. So to help us with audience participation, we're asking you to do so in the chat box. Please put your questions in there in English or in French, and we will do our best to answer in the time available. Also, feel free to share your thoughts about the election, about what's at stake for childcare. So with all of that, let's begin. And I want to first direct my question to Chantal. Chantal, you're currently based in British Columbia. You're a parent of two children, and you're a longtime advocate for racial and gender justice and equity. And in British Columbia, where you're situated, the provincial NDP government has already committed $10 a day for childcare. Can you start off by sharing a bit about what is at stake in this election for you and your family and other families when it comes to childcare?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Anjum, and thank you, Morna, and all of your colleagues for hosting this important discussion. As Anjum said, I'm Chantal Krish. I'm joining you from the beautiful lands of the Coast Salish people here in North Vancouver, which include the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And I'm so grateful to be able to live and work and play with my family on these beautiful lands. So thank you. As Anjum said in her kind introduction, I'm a mother of two. I have a 3-year-old and a 9.5-month-old. So I'm in the thick of it when it comes to kids and childcare. And, beyond that, I have been a longtime advocate for childcare even before I had children. And I worked with the YWCA Metro Vancouver, where we advocated for childcare as part of a core platform of advancement of gender equality, supported Anjum and her colleagues at the national office, and have also been a longtime supporter, advocate, and friend of the Coalition of Childcare Advocates here in British Columbia, and been working with them and supporting the work that they've really led over the last number of decades to ensure that $10 a day childcare is top of mind for politicians, decision makers, and the public, spending a lot of time informing the public and building an informed public so we can all understand the many benefits. And so the result of this advocacy we've seen is the adoption and implementation of $10 a day sites across the province. So pilot sites that have been put into action and implemented and really through nonprofit providers, YWCA Metro Vancouver being one of them. And so I've seen firsthand, I have friends that are lucky to have some of their kids in these sites, and I've seen how they've been able to just reshift and reframe their priorities, particularly women and the mothers, being able to think about their careers in a more long-term strategic way, because that huge burden of how are my children going to be cared for has been lifted in a way that's focused on quality and affordability. So I've seen that. I've seen the huge benefits it could have. As a parent, I can speak to my own experience just a little bit. I've been through the roller coaster of childcare. So I really didn't get how hard it would be, even though I've been a longtime advocate, until I became a parent, how hard it is to put your kids in a place where you don't feel is they're going to receive the best quality care. And that's been something that I've had direct experience with. We lived in Victoria for a few years, where I was working for the provincial government, and never could find a place for my little girl, Uma, that met the standard of quality that we really wanted for her, or places were shut down or they were unlicensed. So there was no standard of quality. And so we ended up compromising affordability. We had to hire a full-time caregiver to be in our home, and that we're privileged to just be able to do that. But I acknowledge that there's a lot of families that don't. And only now, she's 3 years old, have I found a place for her that's nonprofit run, that aligns with the philosophies, with the standard of care, with the equitable support and compensation for staff, that has a holistic benefit to her, to the families involved, and to us as parents. So we can finally rest easy. But that's 3 years in the making, moving around and really trying to develop a piecemeal solution. So what's at stake? All of those things. The affordability piece is huge. I know that that's a really common point that's come up across this election. But if childcare isn't prioritized, then for families, affordability is just, for many, off the table. For women and mothers, it's a game changer to have your kids in quality, affordable childcare. Like I said earlier, I've seen with my friends, they're able to actually think more long-term about their career development and their economic prosperity without having to compromise the quality of their children, the care for their children, which they just won't do. So I think that that's a huge piece. And we've seen childcare be positioned as the key economic growth strategy for our economy. So I think all of these pieces, coupled together, that's what's at stake. For women of color, for marginalized folks, for women that work in the care sector, that work at these places that are caring for our children, huge implications if we don't provide equitable, fair compensation. So I'll leave it at that. But I'm really grateful that this discussion is being brought together, because it's, I think, the key piece during this election that we all need to be top of mind. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And many would argue it is the defining issue because of what is at stake with all of these agreements that have been already put in place. Thank you so much, Chantel. And so next I want to turn to Margot. And Margot, I wanted to share, while it's true that childcare has been a bigger issue in this federal election compared to previous, there's still not enough coverage in the party platforms or in the media around the distinct needs of Indigenous communities and Indigenous children in particular, and especially around early learning and childcare needs. And so Margot, as someone who has been deeply involved in this work, fighting for inclusive childcare needs for Indigenous communities, can you share what your thoughts are on this election? What is next after this election? And what are you hopeful for or not when it comes to childcare in this country? Sorry, Margot, I think you may be on. Yeah. Thank you.
I always forget to unmute. Maybe it's a good thing. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak and for the question. And I'm really grateful for your gracious introduction this morning. I want to begin by saying that I'm speaking from the unceded territories of the Silks people, upon whose lands I live with my family and my 3 sons. I'm deeply grateful to them every day for the opportunity to be here. My comments this morning are from my personal observations and experiences, and are informed in part by my academic background. I do not speak for all Indigenous people, and I just want to be really clear about that, because I think Indigenous people need to speak for themselves. And you've given me this opportunity, so here I am. Let me begin by situating some of my comments, and these are my own personal thoughts and observations and ideas. And the first is that Canada, the Canadian state, is a colonial state, and that the Canadian state has made over a century's worth of effort to eliminate Indigenous children. We have 215 plus graves of Indigenous children at one residential school that tell the story of those efforts. This, to me, is the context in which Indigenous early learning and childcare is really situated. I am also a daughter of a family who survived residential schools, a mother of 3 sons who did not have the opportunity to be cared for in early learning and childcare programs that acknowledge their heritage or rights to culturally based care. We need early learning and childcare services to support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children and families. Prior to the early 1990s, there were virtually no formal early learning and childcare options for First Nations families living in their home communities. By the mid-1990s, we began to see the emergence of formal ELCC programs. For example, the First Nations Inuit Childcare Initiative and the Aboriginal Head Start programs. We've come a long way since then. Today's Indigenous Early Learning and Childcare Framework Agreement is permeated on principles of self-determination and distinctions-based priorities. This agreement is situated in a unique social political context that affirms the right of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples to care for their children. We've not always had that right in this country. In 1996, the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples acknowledged the right of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children to access culturally based early childhood education, regardless of status or locale. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognizes the rights of Indigenous families and communities to be responsible for the upbringing, training, education, and well-being of their children. It's always remarkable to me when I read that, the years that people have not had that fundamental right that so many others take for granted. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls on all levels of government in Canada to develop culturally appropriate early childhood education programs for Aboriginal families. This is the context in which Indigenous early learning and childcare framework sits. The framework calls for a comprehensive, coordinated system of early learning and childcare policies, programs, and services that is led by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and is rooted in their Indigenous knowledges, their cultures, and their languages. Through an Indigenous early learning and childcare system, families and communities determine what is best for their children. Quality early learning and childcare services are anchored in their knowledge, their language, and their culture. It has taken us a long time to get here. All of these years of work and families' dreams for their children are at stake in this election. Many Indigenous children live away from home and in urban locales. The Canada-wide agreements with provinces and territories, many of which provide valuable services for Indigenous children and families alongside Indigenous-specific programs, are critical. All of these systems are important supports to the health and well-being of Indigenous children, their families, and their nations. This is what is at stake in this election: the lives of children and their families, the very future of our shared lands. My hope in this election lies in the resilience and strength of Indigenous people who have endured for thousands of years. My hope is that all people value their children and their futures enough to continue to fight for a country that honors Indigenous peoples as the first peoples of this land and maintains the respect and dignity of all. This journey, in my opinion, my humble opinion, begins with our children. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Margot. And I think it really highlights what is most important: the future of this land and the future of our communities, and centering children at the heart of it all. Thank you very much. I'd like to now turn to David. And David, as an economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and no doubt also as a father of 2 young children yourself, you have a particular interest in childcare policy. You were one of the first policy analysts in the country to examine the refundable childcare tax credit that Erin O'Toole is proposing in lieu of the $30 billion plus federal commitment to building a nationwide early learning and childcare system. Can you explain for us here how the tax credit would work, and share your assessment if it stacks up against other proposed measures for childcare, especially around reducing costs and increasing affordability, such as the Liberals and the NDP's $10 a day childcare?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for the invitation here today. In short, the Conservative credit refunds a portion of childcare expenses in a direct transfer. However, the other piece that's also happening at the same time is a proposed cancellation of the childcare expense deduction, which is another way that parents can write off a portion of childcare expenses against their income. The proposed Conservative credit is actually almost a carbon copy of the existing Quebec refundable tax credit. Now, Quebec is actually not the only province with a refundable tax credit. Ontario has one, as does Newfoundland and Labrador. In Quebec and Ontario, each one of these credits will refund up to 75% of your childcare expenses, up to $8,000. Now, it's worth pointing out that only in the cities with set fee systems are licensed childcare spots less than $8,000, and in almost all cases in Canadian big cities, they're more than $8,000. But that is the cap that's currently in place for these childcare expenses. Now, in Quebec and Ontario, it's only families making about $30,000 or less that can get the full 75%. As your income increases, the amount that you can get back from the credit decreases. So at the very high end, if you made $1 million, say, the Conservative as well as the Quebec credit would refund you 26% of what you spent. Newfoundland also has a credit, although it's only 9% of the expenses that you paid, and it isn't dependent on income. Now, the other thing that's very important to note here is that because particularly Quebec and Ontario already have these credits, they will have to change their credits. Otherwise, people will get refunded more than they paid. So in the case of Ontario or Quebec, if you received 75% of your childcare expenses back from the Conservative plan, plus 75% of your childcare expenses back from the provinces, well, that adds up to 150% of what you paid. Well, it makes no sense to refund more than what you paid. And so what's going to happen in Quebec and Ontario, how the provinces change their own credits to let the feds pay first and then potentially top up, or maybe just plain cancel their own credits, could make a big difference for what parents see in the end in those 2 biggest provinces. Now, the maximum benefit that you can get if you take $8,000 and multiply it by 75% is $6,000. And this is the amount that's been publicized a fair amount. The issue is that there's basically no families that will receive the full value of the conservative credit of $6,000 per child. In fact, I calculated the exact number. It's only 6,600 families out of 3.7 million families with children under 18 that would get the full $6,000. The averages, in fact, are much lower. Even if you look at the lowest income decile for families making under $22,000 a year, their average gain from the conservative credit would be about $1,500. Most of the middle of the income spectrum would see gains of $500 to $1,000, depending on their circumstances. At very high incomes, there's very little loss or gain. You would gain this new credit, but you would lose the child care expense deduction. And overall, there's no average gain or loss. Now, I think the real question is, how does this conservative credit compare to the Liberal Green NDP plan of halving fees by 2022? There is a $10 a day commitment by 2026, but let's compare both plans in the same year, 2022, the conservative plan via the tax credit and the Liberal NDP and Green plan through a halving of fees. In the 37 cities for which we have data, in 32 cities, this is basically all the cities outside Quebec, the average family gets more benefit when fees are cut in half than they do from the conservative tax credit. In Toronto, this is the most extreme example. Parents would see $10,000 a year more in savings under a system where fees are cut in half compared to a conservative plan of a tax credit. So the tax credit plan would refund the average Toronto family about $1,000 a year, whereas a halving of fees would save the average Toronto family about $11,000 a year. And again, this is all in 2022. Now, if you fast forward to 2026 towards a plan of $10 a day, then the difference is much more extreme still. But even in 2022, most families, particularly who are seeking licensed care for non-school age children, would see much larger savings in almost all of the big cities under a halving of fees rather than the conservative tax credit. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, David. And I think that really helps to break down what is on offer by all the different political parties and helps us realize what exactly would benefit us in the communities we're part of. So thank you so much, David, for helping illuminate that for us. Sophie, I want to turn it over to you. You're currently based in Quebec, which is often regarded as the place we can go to learn more about childcare and how to do it well. And in this election, two very different responses, as David has articulated, around addressing early learning and childcare have been proposed. The Liberals, NDP, and Green say the federal government has a role to play around building a publicly funded system of early learning and childcare in the same way that Canada has done for many other things, including education, for example. And on the other hand, we're hearing in some of the proposals put forward by the Conservative Party of Canada that believes it is best for parents to get support in covering the costs of childcare, and a publicly funded system is not required. So David has spoken and talked about which approach can work best. I'm wondering, as someone with in-depth knowledge in Quebec, where there's both a publicly funded childcare system and a refundable tax credit for those who do not access the childcare system, what is at stake? What are the consequences of public money going to one system versus another? And what are the consequences, especially for children? So I know that's quite a bit, so I'll give you a second to digest, but if you can share with us all of here today. I am so sorry, Sophie, we cannot hear you. So just wanted to let you know. No,
and Sophie should be heard in the French channel, and then Linda, you will be heard in the English channel.
Thank you so much for that correction. Yes, that's right. Absolutely. So folks, just make sure that you're in the right channel. I've made that adjustment for myself. Go ahead, Sophie. Thank you.
Sorry, the interpreter regrets, but she cannot hear Sophie.
Okay, so I'm going to troubleshoot. And what I'm going to ask folks to do is to click on the English channel if you would like to listen to Linda interpret. And Sophie, I am going to bring you over just to the main channel. So French folks, unclick French, and English folks, click English. And if you have any issues, please direct message me and I will help you to troubleshoot. I will just set that up.
Erica, this is the interpreter for English booth. Could you please reassign the English booth interpreter? The languages have disappeared.
Yes, it has been updated. So again, French folks, turn interpretation off. And English folks, you are going to hear the interpretation by clicking the English channel, and our interpreter will interpret in that channel. All right, we can resume.
D'accord. Donc, je veux commencer par vous remercier pour la belle invitation. Et avant de vous parler de mes observations par rapport au Québec, je veux préciser que le cas du Québec est beaucoup plus complexe que ce que les partis politiques ou même certains analystes le laissent entendre. Donc, le Québec, à l'intérieur de sa province, offre, oui, un réseau de services de garde à la petite enfance à 8,50 $, mais le Québec offre aussi des places non subventionnées qui sont offertes au prix du marché et pour lesquelles les parents peuvent recevoir un crédit d'impôt remboursable, tout comme David vient de nous l'expliquer. On a donc à l'intérieur du Québec ce que les libéraux, le NPD et les Verts veulent mettre en place, c'est-à-dire un réseau subventionné. Et on a également, à l'intérieur du Québec, des places qui sont offertes au prix du marché avec des crédits d'impôt pour aider les parents à payer les frais de garde pour leurs enfants dans l'âge préscolaire. Donc maintenant, quand les politiciens comme Chrystia Freeland montrent une certaine admiration à l'égard du modèle québécois de service de garde, ils font bien évidemment référence aux places subventionnées à 8,50 $ par jour. Il faut mentionner qu'au Québec, il y a 77 % de l'ensemble des places dans le réseau qui sont offertes à ce prix-là, à 8,50 $ par jour. Il faut savoir toutefois que ces places à 8,50 $ par jour sont offertes, si on simplifie un peu, dans deux types de services de garde. Le premier, c'est celui qui fait l'objet d'admiration du Canada, c'est les CPE, qui sont des services de garde, les CPE, les centres de la petite enfance, qui sont des services de garde offerts dans des installations à but non lucratif. Et parallèlement, des services à 8,50 $ sont également offerts dans des garderies commerciales. Donc, dans la garderie commerciale, le but premier, c'est de faire du profit. L'objectif premier, c'est donc d'aller maximiser les gains. La différence entre les CPE et les garderies est importante. Une garderie n'est pas un CPE, c'est une entreprise. Et la différence entre les CPE et les garderies n'est pas simplement au niveau idéologique. En fait, les données nous montrent qu'il y a une différence dans la qualité des soins qui sont offerts aux tout-petits, les CPE offrant une meilleure qualité de soins que les garderies, vous l'aurez deviné. Les autres places du réseau, environ 23 % des places, sont offertes dans des garderies commerciales qui offrent des places non subventionnées. C'est-à-dire, les parents doivent payer le plein prix selon les lois du marché et ce prix pour une place en garderie oscille entre 35 $ et 55 $ par jour par enfant. Maintenant, ces places-là, évidemment, sont rarement le premier choix des parents. Les parents préfèrent évidemment 8,50 $ par jour, mais il faut mentionner qu'au Québec, il y a un manque criant de places en service de garde. On estime qu'environ 50 000 enfants présentement sont en attente d'une place en service de garde. Donc, devant ce manque criant de place, il y a des parents qui sont obligés de se tourner vers les garderies commerciales et le gouvernement aide à défrayer les coûts d'une place en service de garde, tout comme David l'a expliqué, en offrant un crédit d'impôt remboursable dont la valeur se situe entre 26 et 75 des coûts. Maintenant, que peut-on apprendre de la situation du Québec? Parce que le Québec est souvent connu comme étant le modèle à suivre. Comment est-ce qu'on peut, qu'est-ce qui fonctionne le mieux? La première chose à mentionner, c'est que, et encore là, David l'a mentionné, même avec un crédit d'impôt, pour la plupart des familles, les services de garde dans les garderies commerciales sont plus chers. Donc, il y a évidemment un enjeu financier ici. C'est moins cher pour les familles de payer 8,50 $ que le prix du marché. Maintenant, et c'est sans doute ce qui est le plus important, c'est que la qualité des soins envers les tout-petits est largement supérieure dans les services de garde à but non lucratif, dans les CPE, autrement dit. Et ça, on sait ça au Québec depuis le début des années 2000. Il y a une étude longitudinale qui a été faite au début des années 2000 qui a montré que, et là, ce n'est pas tellement reluisant pour le Québec, seulement 27 % de l'ensemble des services de garde offrent des soins de qualité jugés entre bonnes et excellentes. Mais il faut ajouter 2 bémols à ce constat. Donc, environ un service de garde sur 3 qu'on souhaite pour nos enfants. Premier bémol, c'est que en dépit de cette donnée qui n'est pas très reluisante, la forte majorité des services de garde offrent une qualité minimale où la santé et la sécurité des enfants est garantie. Deuxième bémol, c'est que la qualité est plus souvent au rendez-vous dans les centres de la petite enfance que dans les garderies commerciales. Donc, il y a 35 % des CPE qui sont à but non lucratif, qui offrent des services jugés de qualité bonne à excellente, mais seulement 14 % des garderies commerciales. Donc, il y a un enjeu de qualité, une différence très importante entre les services de garde à but lucratif et à but non lucratif. On peut se poser la question, pourquoi est-ce que c'est comme ça? Il y a plein de raisons sur lesquelles je n'ai pas le temps de discuter très longtemps, mais un des éléments de réponse qui est assez déterminant se trouve dans le ratio d'éducatrices formées dans chacun des types de services de garde. Jusqu'à tout récemment, le règlement sur les services de garde éducatifs à l'enfance au Québec prévoyait que 2 éducatrices sur 3 devaient être qualifiées, c'est-à-dire qu'elles devaient avoir un diplôme en éducation à l'enfance qui est enseigné au niveau collégial. Or, ce ratio de 2 éducatrices formées sur 3 est largement respecté dans les CPE. En fait, les dernières données nous montrent que dans 92 % des CPE, on respecte ce ratio-là. Mais lorsqu'on regarde dans les garderies commerciales subventionnées, encore une fois, qui offrent des places à 8,50 $, ce ratio n'est pas de 92 %, mais de 81 %.
And
Et lorsqu'on...
Sophie, actually, on that.
Oui, yeah.
Absolutely. And actually, Sophie, on that point, you're mentioning quality as that being one of the pieces that is at risk potentially going one way or the other. I want to actually pull in Chantel and Margot because there's an interesting question that's come up and it's around quality. So you mentioned one piece, which is the ratio of educators to children. And I'm wondering, one of the opponents to regulated childcare programs, they say are, perhaps these programs are not as inclusive, perhaps not as culturally safe. And I'm wondering, many children with special needs, people raise that as a potential point. I'm wondering if Chantel, Margot, as well, Sophie, if you'd like to comment on that kind of comment that people might have about regulated childcare programs.
Je peux y aller. Je ne sais pas si mes collègues, mais il y a un enjeu de difficulté à avoir un accès plus grand pour les enfants avec des besoins particuliers dans les CPE et dans les garderies commerciales. Mais dans les CPE, on est obligé au Québec de réserver un certain nombre de places pour des enfants à besoins particuliers. Il y a également des services en tant que maman d'un enfant à besoins particuliers qui fréquente un CPE. Je peux vous dire qu'il y a des services adaptés, gratuits, qui sont offerts dans les CPE et ce qui n'est pas le cas des garderies commerciales. Donc, pour les enfants à besoins particuliers, il y a une différence notable. Je peux continuer.
Yeah, and oh, sorry.
No, I'm done.
Okay, maybe Chantel?
Sorry, Sophie, I didn't want to interrupt. Did you have something to?
Non, je veux vous laisser. Allez-y.
Okay, merci. I was just going to say that I think if we want to have high quality and cultural safety and support for children with special needs, we need a workforce that are trained and empowered and equitably compensated to meet those needs. And so I think, one of the really core tenets of the $10 a day work that's happened here and the research that's being developed across the country is how to leverage the care economy, how to develop a workforce and ensure that kind of support so that the children that are going to childcare are really equitably compensated. And I know working at a nonprofit organization, YWCA, that's run childcare, and being part of now leading an organization, Kids Safe here in British Columbia, that works with children and families, it's in the people behind these programs that make our children best cared for. So I think we need to ensure that part is also at the forefront. There's a wage grid that's been developed here that's being adopted across the province. And there's a lot of other things that can go into play to ensure that quality is there. And also that we encourage diversity and inclusion in all of our hiring practices and attracting our talent. But I'm sure I would love to hear from Margot on that piece too, because I know that there's so much more to offer to this part of the conversation.
Thank you. I would agree with the points that Sophie has made. And of course, you as well, Chantel. I think one fundamentally for Indigenous children and families, access to services is critical. We haven't had any for many years. And so what does that really look like? And still there are areas where there are no services. And I think that's an important thing to think about. We can't take for granted that there is access because it doesn't exist for some. I think services that are culturally respectful of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children and families are services that see where children and families can see themselves. That could be in the workforce. So Indigenous caregivers, early childhood educators. That could be just in the environment. That could be in the conversations and the curriculum itself that recognizes these children and families. And part of that is engaging with community. I think it's really important to think about how do we engage with community? How do we bring them in? How do we bring the families in? How do we bring community? And I guess when I think about this, and this comes from years and years ago when I was doing some work in California, the whole notion of anti-bias curriculum, that really gets us to diversity. And I think I said that in my opening comments. There needs to be respect for all. We need to figure out how we're going to live here together on these shared lands in a way that is respectful to all of the families and all of the children. Now, we have a unique status in this country being the first peoples of the land. But these are shared lands. And, I truly believe that all of the children should be cared for in high quality, the best we can do for all of our children. It's not us. And I mean, I'm getting to the point where I can say that. You're all much younger than I am, but, you know, I'm getting to the point where I can just say, you know, it's my children and my grandchildren that are going to carry these words forward and realize this. We have to create that space for them to live in harmony. So I could go on and on about specifics, but I think that's it. But I think it's a really important concept. I'll just say this last thing. It's going to be a really important concept in all childcare settings, because our children, some of our children live in their home communities, but many of our children and families do not. And so how do they, with a right to their language, to their culture, how are they going to access that? That is a challenge. We have a lot of work to do in this country around that. Thank you.
Thank you, Margot, and a very powerful call to action for all of us. And thank you, Chantal. Thank you, Margot. Sophie, are there any final comments around quality that you wanted to share while we're on this thread?
Je veux simplement mentionner qu'il y a seulement 33% des garderies privées qui offrent des services de qualité au Québec. Donc, pardon, qui offrent qui ont un ratio d'éducatrices formées de 2 éducatrices sur 3. Donc, on ne peut pas assurer la qualité quand on a un réseau où un grand nombre d'éducatrices n'est pas qualifié. Et dans le cas du Québec, ce qu'on voit depuis les derniers mois, c'est que c'est même plus, on ne demande même plus à avoir 2 éducatrices sur 3. On est tellement en pénurie de main-d'œuvre que c'est 1 éducatrice sur 3 parce que la situation n'est pas bonne au Québec non plus. Elle est meilleure probablement que bien d'autres endroits au Canada, mais il faut faire attention quand on dit on veut suivre le Québec, il faut vraiment regarder ce qu'on veut suivre parce qu'on est un bon élève et on n'est pas si bon que ça finalement.
I think that's really important for us to all be mindful of as we are engaging in conversations about childcare. What are the complex nuances? What are the details? Details matter in that quality conversation. And thank you to everyone chiming in on that front. I wanted to pull in David here for another question that has come up through different messages here. And it's along the same lines as the first question we had posed to you. And it's around, you know, another critique or concern people might have around $10 a day childcare. Some may be concerned that this will only benefit those who have access to regulated childcare spots, not those who have access to informal paid childcare arrangements, other forms outside of the system-based one. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, when you want to lower fees to this degree, you're going to increase the demand for those spaces. So more people will say, oh, I can work and have affordable childcare, so I can increase my family income. It does make sense for me now to go back to work. Now, it's much more likely women than men that say that. And so one of the reasons why the Quebec system was implemented in the first place was an attempt to increase female labor force participation. Presumably, we'd see something like that nationally as well. Now, of course, the issue is if you don't increase the number of spaces, but you lower the fees, what do you end up with? You end up with long wait lists. And so this is certainly the case. This was certainly the case in Quebec when the system was implemented in the 90s. And when we do see pilot projects in British Columbia, as well as in Calgary, the wait lists for centers that have $25 a day or $10 a day are substantially longer than the wait lists that are charging market rate. Now, none of that's a particular surprise. The issue, of course, is that you not only want to reduce fees, but you also want to increase the number of spaces. So you want a systemic approach. You don't just want to say, oh, fees are $10 a day, let the market sort it out, quote unquote. Well, the market's going to sort it out with long wait lists, unfortunately. And so what you're going to want to do in addition to that is build out the number of spaces. But a space is just some room in a building. I mean, childcare is not about room in a building. Childcare is about the people that care for the children. And so we talk about spaces as if it's you know, a section of a building someplace, but it's about the workers. This is about the people that staff those positions. So certainly you need more capital, physical space. And that's what you need first, because you need to build that space and equip it appropriately. But after that, what you need is people to work in those spaces. And so it can't just be about capital, it needs to be about workers. And hopefully those workers are actually trained as opposed to untrained, because again, it's cheaper to hire untrained workers and it's faster to hire untrained workers. And so these are really the nuances that come with building an actual system that does provide affordable care, but it provides enough spaces for people, hopefully where they live. Oftentimes it's downtown cores of cities that have much more spaces than suburbs, but also provides people to staff those locations and provides high quality workers, to staff those locations. And so, I mean, if we want a high quality system, we have to deal with all those pieces. That's a complex argument. You're not going to hear that, in a debate. You're going to hear $10 a day, because I think that's what parents understand. I think one of the challenges too, when you talk about space creation, is that that's really lost meaning for a lot of parents. It doesn't mean anything to them. I created 10,000 spaces. Well, I still pay $60 a day in Toronto. Like it doesn't matter, right? So, I mean, I appreciate the fact that we're reducing fees. I think that's much more tangible. And so the other pieces should be discussed as well. We're discussing them, and it certainly has been part of the discussion in the negotiations with the provinces. We're very early days. I mean, all these agreements could be canceled next week. So, they haven't been implemented, so they could be canceled next week. That being said, hypothetically, if they did proceed, we would definitely want to keep a close eye, not just on the reduction in cost, which is something that I track in great detail, but also the space creation, training of VCEs, and wages of VCEs, so they're not turning over all the time.
Thank you, David. And really, it highlights the different prongs that we must put our attention to as a childcare movement, as people who care about this, and also are advocating for this. So we've run out of time almost, but we do have some time for some final comments. And what I would encourage everyone, for all the panelists, is to share a call to action. Monday is election day. Some folks, in the order of millions, have already done advanced voting. There's others who may be doing mail-in voting. But this decision may be happening at the ballot box on Monday. It also is the start of Gender Equality Week. So what does it mean when we think about this democracy that we're in, the decisions before us, and our commitment to gender equality in this conversation about childcare? So with that, I'd like to maybe first start with Chantel, the order we began in, to share a closing thought for the audience here.
My first closing thought would be to vote. So thank you so much for the reminder of that. And also, I really liked what David was saying around the things we're not going to hear about in the debates and in the discussions, how there's so many complexities to accessible childcare. But I think at the core of it is it must be affordable, it must be high quality, and it certainly does help our women, our mothers, it advances gender equality, and it grows our economy. So those are the things you're voting for when you vote childcare. So really just keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Chantel. Over to you, Margot.
Margot, you appear to be on mute.
There. See, I was getting all excited by myself here. Chantel, I can't underscore enough. Please, people vote. That is so important in this election. I guess as I'm thinking about it, it's for us to all consider, and you're right, Anju, in your opening comments, you said there hasn't been a lot of conversation around Indigenous early learning and childcare in this, and yet we are very much a presence, and it is very important to us. I think in this country, I really want to see the opportunity to build that system of early learning and childcare for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in this country, to build that on self-determination, distinction-based priorities. I think that's absolutely fundamental. It speaks to the survival of our nations. For all of us, it's our children and the generations to come. Really important. for us in this time. And I don't see, one of the things I don't see in all these parties and all of this is our own leaders, our own governments in these conversations. And I think that's really important as well. So vote, please vote.
Thank you, Margot. David, over to you for final words.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And certainly this is, for folks interested in childcare, this is an election about childcare. The Liberal NDP Green Plan is the most substantial investment in childcare that we've seen in at least 30 years. It's far bigger than what was being proposed in 2005 that ended up not being implemented. And it's two fundamentally different approaches to childcare. One is the market system with some government interventions. You can predictably see where that has led in many cases, particularly in places like the big cities where it's led to very high fees and not necessarily more spaces. You still have wait. It's not like there's no wait lists. I mean, there's still high fees and long wait lists. When we do our childcare fee survey every year, me and my co-author, Martha Friendly, we find that the most affordable places in the country are always in provinces with set fees, with transfers to make up the difference, those being the cities of Quebec, obviously, but also Manitoba, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador. Those are the places with the most affordable childcare. And so within the Canadian context, it's fairly clear how you provide more affordable care. And so I encourage people to vote and examine on a city-by-city basis how likely it is that they're going to see some savings and how much savings they might see. I've got a fair amount of calculations on my analysis.
Thanks, David. And for folks throughout the chat, there's been incredible resources placed. Be sure to check it out, including David's work. Sophie, last word to you.
En fait, au Québec, la situation est complètement différente parce qu'on a déjà un réseau. Donc, l'enjeu n'est pas le même. Au Québec, ce qui fait parler, ce n'est pas tant la création d'un réseau, mais l'accès à ce réseau parce que, comme je le mentionnais, il manque environ 50 000 places. Maintenant, dans le cas du Québec, et puis ce sera ma dernière observation, c'est que cette pression qui est présentement mise sur le gouvernement pour créer des nouvelles places en garderie se fait au détriment de la qualité de ces places-là. Alors, on voit beaucoup de garderies temporaires qui émergent. Les conditions de travail des éducatrices ne sont pas excellentes. Il y a un manque d'intérêt pour la profession. Donc, dans le cas du Québec, la difficulté d'avoir accès à une place vient mettre de l'ombre sur l'enjeu de la qualité. Et avec le gouvernement actuel, c'est ce qu'on voit vraiment. Mais évidemment, on a un réseau. Donc, l'élection n'a pas la même signification au Québec.
Thank you so much. And I think it's an important reminder. A system is something that will be an ongoing journey. It's not like something that one day we'll have. And I think it's something where we will continuously need to improve upon. So thank you so much, Sophie, for sharing. And with that is the last of the set of questions. Thank you immensely to our incredible panelists for sharing their expertise and being generous with their time. We've learned immensely. I've learned immensely. Thank you so much. Before we conclude for today, we have some actions that you can take because we are in election season. We want you to take action around childcare for all. And so there's 3 things that we're encouraging everyone to do. First, sign Childcare Now's petition that's directed at all the federal parties. No matter what the results of this election will be, we're going to have to make it clear to Parliament that Canadians need and want affordable, high-quality childcare for all. A link to the petition is being tagged in the chat box, and you can also find it at www.timeforchildcare.ca. When we think about this crisis, when we think about this pandemic, we have to think about what will be the legacy of this time. And many would argue, and perhaps many here as well, let it be childcare. So that's something that we're encouraging everyone to do. Number 2, we're asking, again, go to www.timeforchildcare.ca and click on the election page. Morna and the incredible team at Childcare Now have prepared many tools for you to engage in the election. You can sign downloadable window signs and lawn signs. So as candidates continue to come at the doors, they can see very clearly that childcare is an issue that matters to you. So please be sure to check it out. There's also social media messages that you can copy and paste on your Twitter and social media accounts, so you can amplify online. And finally, join the Childcare Now movement. If you're not yet signed up for the newsletter, please do. Again, it's being put in the chat box. This is how we continue the conversation. This is how we continue to put pressure, because yes, we need to engage and organize at the ballot box, but it has to be all year round as well. And this is your ticket in. And so with that, I'd like to thank all of the panelists. Many thanks, Chantel, Margot, David, Sophie, for again, that incredibly valuable information. And what I would encourage folks, if you want to download the chat before you exit, feel free to do so, because there's some excellent material there that people have been continuously putting in. So with that, thank you again. Thank you for your interest, and let's make childcare the defining issue of this election. Thanks, folks.